Hey guys, this is Eric Weingart with Weingart Racing. Today's video is about my tour of Scat. Scat makes crankshafts and rods, and I'll explain all of that. Before I get into the video so much, I want to start off by saying, although I used to build about 6 engines a year, which isn't really that lot, it is a lot for a one-man shop that also supports cylinder heads. At least it felt like a lot. But I don't build engines anymore. So there's probably some things that are more intricate, and as far as the engine building stuff as crankshaft and rods go, that I may not know about. And I only mention this because I'm sure I'm going to say some things wrong in this video. I'm going to try my best to get it correct. And there's some questions I have too that I'm going to email Tom Lieb at Scat about when I get some more free time. But I guess I'm just a disclaimer that I don't know as much about engine building as I do about cylinder heads. And I would say I'm an engine builder. Here's how I define it. Did you build the engine twice? Here's what I mean. Did you mock it up, put it all together, check all the clearances, then take it back apart, thoroughly clean it, and put it back together? That to me is an engine builder versus an engine similar, just throws things together and hopes for the best. But I just want to give a disclaimer first that there's probably lots of stuff that several of you may know more about in this area. So it's not my specialty. So in case you're wondering why I stopped in building engines, it wasn't that I did anything wrong. It's just I didn't have time. I focused more on the cylinder heads. Really, the only reason why I ever built engines to begin with was because it was the only way to show off the cylinder heads. So there you go. So anyway, let's get started with today. Scat is, there were 3 really companies that make up Scat. You had Scat that made crankshafts and rods. Then you got Scat Pro Car, which makes seats. And then you had Scat VW. Scat was started by a guy named Tom Lieb, and it started way back when. I'm probably gonna get the dates wrong, but many years ago. And I'll get to the story of how it got started. But currently, Scat is now owned differently. So Scat crankshaft and rods and Pro Car seats were sold to the company that owns AFR cylinder heads, and that's the reason why I got to go down to see Scat itself, because I was up there to see AFR. Scat VW is still owned by Tom Lieb. So I'm going to do probably a horrible job of doing the history of it, because I listened to Tom Lieb talk about the history of it and trying to absorb all that information, and he gives a bunch. It's pretty, he knows a lot, so it's hard to grasp all that as quick as I can. So on cylinder heads, I'd probably more, pick it all up, but that stuff's, it's more in depth. So at least for my knowledge base. So here's how Tom Lieb, by the way, started Scat. He's now 81 years old. Now, when you think of an 81-year-old guy, and I think of an 81-year-old guy, I think of someone that's a bit more stiff and doesn't get around as much. That's not Tom. Matter of fact, when he came out, I really thought this guy's probably in his early 70s, maybe upper 60s. And very active. His mind's definitely there for sure. And I'm sure they hate that when people get to the 80s and they're like, oh, you talk about my mind like it's not there. Well, I clearly are. But it's probably, I would have liked to meet him when he was in his 30s, so I bet it would have been about the same. Anyway, he talks about how he started his company. He started off by, he would buy parts from junkyards and salvage yards and then sell them, maybe modify them and sell them back, and that's how he'd make his money. And I'm probably butchering this job because there's way more in depth than that. And that's how it kind of grew. Well, at the time, there was a crankshaft company that was in California. By the way, Scat's in Redondo Beach, California. There was a crankshaft company that was in California, and they offered Tom the option to buy that company that was making performance crankshafts, and Tom bought it. So at that point, Tom went into the crankshafts and that sort of thing. And there's a bunch of cool stories, and I'll try my best to tell some of them about Tom, because he talks about how he got into it, what I told you, because to me that's most fascinating. When you look at how a person, just one person, starts this gigantic company that ends up making millions and does such great things, to me that's a fascinating story. Well, in his case, it started off just selling parts from a salvage yard. So it was a really interesting story. Well, he buys a crankshaft company and starts making crankshafts. And then he tells the story that if you guys have watched the movie Ford versus Ferrari, which is a great movie, he said, my crankshafts were in that. Those engines. He said, those were mine. I was like, well, I didn't have any idea of that, never even thought of it. But he said what had happened was, and this would be way back when, I think in the 60s, I'm probably getting the dates wrong again. he said that Ford approached him and said, we would like for you to do our crankshafts, but we want you to have this very specific machine to cut the crankshafts. And I'll talk more about the reason for that later, because that one's pretty important. And Tom says, man, it was quite a deal, because I went to go look for this crankshaft machine that they were talking about to see how much it cost. And the guy had said, I quoted him like $500 and something thousand for this piece of equipment. Remember, this is like 1960s, so it's an insanely expensive piece of equipment. And he's like, he didn't think if he had enough money to do it. And so he says, he calls him back and says, look, man, is there any way, you could do anything better? And the guy actually calls, sorry, I got it backwards. The crankshaft guy that made the machine called him and said, Tom, I'm gonna need to come out and visit you because you're gonna buy a machine today. And Tom's like, oh, I am? He said, yes, you're gonna buy this machine today. So he goes to him, gives the whole spiel and everything, and tells him the price. And Tom's like, I just don't think I can afford that. And he knocks it down to like $400,000, which was phenomenally cheaper. He took off like 25 or 30%, Tom was saying. And took off that money, and he said, well, what do I need to get started? And he goes, I can give you a $40,000 check right now, and that will hold the machine. He said, just don't cash that check right away. Anyway, while he's in the office and the guy's there, a different crankshaft company that was making the machine to make crankshafts called him up and said, look, man, I can make you, I want to make you a better deal. You talked to me about it. I think I can make you a deal on this machine. And he goes, well, how much? He goes, it's going to be like $200,000. And he goes, man, if only you'd call just or talk to me just like a few hours. He's like, you're just a little late, but it's like $200,000. So it would have saved him $200,000. He said, I just can't. My word's got to mean something. And he stuck with the guy that he bought the crankshaft machine from. The other machine, he said, ended up getting sold to someone in Florida, and it never made a correct crankshaft. So he talks about how that was, which was a very interesting story. And that's how he got this machine that he still uses. It's still in the shop today, and they use it to grind crankshafts, which is fascinating. Now, he tells more stories, and I'll probably add those in during this. But when you go to Scat itself, it's in Redondo Beach. You won't even, there's not going to be a picture for a little slide here, because if you went to it, you wouldn't really know unless you're in front of it that you're at Scat, because there's no sign that says Scat like there is in front of AFR. It's on the front of the building, which actually faces towards another building, not towards the street. That might sound confusing. The point I'm trying to say is if you reach Scat, you wouldn't know you were there. But anyway, one thing I say about California is they suck at parking. And what I mean by suck at parking is there's no parking. So you go to Scat and there's no parking spaces at all, hardly. So I think they've got like 40-something people, and they've probably got 30-something parking spots. So they're like all crammed in there. If one person needed to leave for lunch, you're blocked behind somebody else's car. I only mention that because I thought, that's strange. But then we went to go visit Buddy Bar, and it's the same way. So California may have a bunch of buildings that have their businesses, but they have no parking for employees, except for AFR did. So anyway, when you go there, and it's a really nice area. So you've got this nice manufacturing facility, but the area itself seems, in my opinion, it's pretty higher end. It'd be, for those that ever visited Tulsa, you go to the Woodland Hills Mall, or you could probably think of your own mall, wherever you have in your town or whatever, that's still active, not the dead malls. And you look at that area around there, that's kind of how it is. I'm just trying to describe it the best I can. Well, anyway, when you go in there, they've got secretaries, and they got like 4 tech guys, and they've got one that works remote, and they take your calls constantly. And I mean to tell you, and the same thing happened at AFR. They're on the phone all the time. So you have 4, if you ever get a business and like, oh, they need to hire more. Dude, they are literally like, bam, another one, bam, another one. They never stop talking, and nonstop. And you wouldn't figure that'd be the case with a crankshaft company, because I don't know, or a rod company, because I don't know how much actual questions you could ask them on the phone versus like a cylinder head company, or say I could see Holley EF5 because there's probably a ton of questions. But anyway, regardless, they're on the phone nonstop. When you go out in the warehouse, that's where you see where things are being done. And this is the part I'm going to tell you about the crankshafts themselves. A good majority of the crankshafts, now they are almost all are made overseas, and a lot of them are finished overseas. And what I mean by that, they're done in China. Now, before you're like, oh, a Chinese product. Most of you already knew that anyway. But I want to say this, and I think it needs to be said. The reason why they're made in China is because you want the prices that China does. And I'm not any different. if there was an actual true American crankshaft, and that most people wouldn't run it because they couldn't afford it. So, and I'll give you a prime example. They were loading at that time, they were taking out of these crates, and all the machine work was actually done in China too. They were taking out the cast steel crankshafts. If you look at the cast steel crankshafts that are running like most of your circle track stuff, because they have to be stock appearing and whatnot, I think they retail around $250, $270. So if you think about how in the world could that ever be made in America, that material alone that just makes up the crankshaft is probably about 80 to 90 bucks once it's poured and everything. You then have the labor actually to machine it all, which is probably going to double that. You would have a crankshaft that costs, you know, once you get through all of it, if it was truly done in America, you'd probably have a $600 cast crankshaft, and they're selling it for $250, and that's probably retail. Don't forget, Scat's not, you know, they might sell it to, like, say, Summit or somebody for $250, and what they're actually selling it to Summit for might be like $200. I'm just guessing. I don't have my price sheet. So in the end, there's no money to be made. It has to be made over in China if they're going to keep going. So like the cast steel crankshafts are literally coming out of the box. They're going to examine them, and then they just rebox them, and then out they go. When you look at some of the other crankshafts, like the forged crankshaft, that's where it gets a little different. Some of them, like if you get, now don't quote me exactly on this, I'm going to call to verify, but I'm fairly certain he said this because Tom was talking. A lot of the forged crankshafts will come out of the crate the same way. All the machine work, everything will have been done in China. So if you got to stay a standard weight Chevy crankshaft, all the rod journals, everything else, all that machine work would be done over in China. They simply put it in a box, and then out the door it goes. The difference is on some of the other crankshafts. For instance, if you were to get a super light crankshaft, not the F43, so let me explain. The F43 and the super light crankshafts, they look really close. There's some differences you could definitely notice. But if you look at the F43, it's pretty much machined, and all of that stuff's done, forged, so it looks like that overseas. So when it comes out of the box, it's pretty much shipped out, and it has to keep the cost down. You then take the super light, which looks very similar, but it's not. That one is rough machined over there, then they fully machine it. They'll cut all the counterweights, do all that stuff here in America. That's why that one's almost double of what the F43 cost due to that. Some of the other crankshafts will be finished up there. In other words, they'll finish the polishing routine. They might, which they had cranks going nonstop, and they were actually Ford crankshafts too. And I'm not sure if they were the billet ones or not, but they do have, I think it's like 6 Burco crank grinders, and they're going nonstop. There's a guy running them all the time who's cutting the journals and whatnot for different things. And they had Fords on there. They might even had an LS on one of them. So I'm not for sure if on some of them those do get finished over there, but I do know some of the crankshafts, the forged ones, are machined over there completely and then boxed up. Not all. So that's a 50-50 deal. I'm not even know about that. However, the billet crankshafts are all in America. And most of you don't even know this, but Scat does make billet crankshafts, and I would run them. They're going to be expensive though, but they're completely machined in America because I saw them. So if you look at theirs, they've got these big old machines that are cutting them. You've got this big old lump, it's this big, and it's round, and it's just billet 4340 steel. And it's a big old tube, and that's what it is. And then they put it on machines and do all their operations, and then it ends up making it into a crankshaft. But it's still got more to go after that. Then it gets heat treated and other things as well before it actually gets completely done. And if you're wondering why billet crankshafts cost so much, just the blank, so this is a round tube of 4340, was $3,500. No machine work, it's just a blank. They're making several of those billet crankshafts every hour. They're grinding them up. Matter of fact, they had some for Cosworth, they had some for the Caterpillar, the big engines. They were doing for those that were in billet. So there's a lot of those going on. So with all the crankshafts that are going on, getting machined and different stuff, this is where Tom told me some of the things that about crankshafts themselves that might make a difference. If you went back to the beginning when I was talking, he was talking about that Ford wanted a specific machine to machine the crankshaft. This is where he mentions it. He talks about this. Ford wanted a specific machine, which they use still currently, and he talks about why it is. It's when they cut the actual crank journals or rod journals, they wanted a machine that would not push the metal, but drag the metal. Excuse me. And what I mean by that is, say you got your round bar like this, you can actually drop your cutter in and then go across this way. And they wanted one that actually went this way and dragged to the ends. And he said the reason for that was because when you push in this way, you're actually pushing stress into the metal, causing a stress area and on that metal, and that will cause it to fail, which we thought was interesting. When you're pulling it back, you're actually pulling it out of the area and it relieves it. And that's a specific way, and Ford had found that out. And that's how they machine all their crankshafts to prevent the stress from being built into the crankshafts that cause them to fail. So that was pretty neat to hear him talk about that. He also did give some other information, and I don't have a crankshaft here to show you, otherwise I would show you this, because he said this. Because I asked him, I said, well, you know, I got some questions about the strength in the crankshaft, say the super light versus your standard one, about how much more power it could take. And this is what I found interesting. He had said that the strongest, the part that receives the most stress in the crankshaft would be from, and I don't have a crankshaft in front of me, so picture this is the rod journal, this is your crank journal. It's the material in between. That's where it breaks. Those two are the only ones. Where the crankshaft is, that's not the part that's going to break. It's going to be between the crank journal and the rod journal. So that's the part that breaks. He said that thickness is the same. If you get a super light crankshaft versus a standard lightweight crankshaft, those are the same. The counterweight's the only thing that got some metal removed. So in theory, those should be the same. Now, he did talk about the heat treating and different companies doing different things, and he was really proud of this, and I have to agree. He said the way that they do heat treating is different from what others do on their heat treating, because he said a lot will just heat treat it and just get the journals and think that that's good, but what you end up having is you have a very hard material on the outside and something soft on the inside, and that creates a gooey substance almost, you could think of it like that, and then that's what causes them to break. He says, we intentionally focus on having it hardened all the way through, and it's much better that way. Makes perfect sense to me. So I share that with you. Besides them, the Burco machines that are grinding crankshafts, and you got a bunch of guys that are finished polishing crankshafts, then what you also have, and like I said, I don't know which ones they were. I know there were some LSs and Fords that were going at that same time, but doesn't mean necessarily all of them. Beyond that, then they've got, and this one was cooler to me, they've got about 8 balancers that are going, because they sell balanced rotating assemblies. In other words, you can call them up, say, hey, I want a crankshaft, this rod, this piston, these rings and bearings, and I want a balance from you. And they'll do it. And I have to say, that's how I typically, when I try to order, I get it that way. And I know some machine shops say, oh, that's not the right way. They don't know what they're doing. I saw what they're doing. And I've seen what other machine shops have done when they come to balancing, and I don't know. I think, I'm not a guru on that, but looking at what they do, it seems a lot better. Because Tom was talking about it, and I agree. For instance, whenever they balance stuff, they'll only ever put 2 holes in any one counterweight. They won't put 3. Instead, what they'll do is they'll take the crankshaft off, and they were doing it. They'll put it on a lathe and cut the crankshaft itself down. Or sorry, not the crankshaft, but the counterweight down to reduce the weight that way instead of just drilling more holes. Like I'm sure several of you have seen where they've pretty much drilled the entire thing instead of using a lathe and cutting down the material to get it to balance. Also, where they're putting holes isn't just at the ends, they put them in different spots. That part went right over my head, but I do understand this part. He says if you just balance it like what the machine says and you just put your holes on the end, what you end up having is, yeah, it's balanced here, but you've got this wave that goes through, and that's causing the crankshaft to flex, and eventually it breaks. I could totally see that as well. It makes perfect sense. And that has something to do also, if you've ever seen the crankshafts that have a center counterweight, that's kind of why they're stronger, is because you still got that wave of balance going through. Well, that center counterweight kind of neutralizes or makes it less, so it's not as much spaghetti noodling the crankshaft, and it's less likely to get that action going that would cause it to break and fail. Perfect sense to me. I'm sure there's a bunch of you who be like, oh my gosh, you're doing it so wrong. I've seen what they were doing and everything. And I asked, well, how are you doing this? They get the crankshaft. This might be why some of you might see something different. They get their weights, and I did see them weigh literally every rod. And I'll get to that in a minute when we get to the rod part. But I saw them weighing every rod. They will take the piston weights themselves from the box, and that might be where some of them get off. is because the boxes their pistons are supposed to be matched like 1 or 2 grams or something, maybe 1 gram. So they'll take those weights, they'll take the weights that they already have for everything else to go with it. In other words, they don't individually pull out every piston from that box and weigh it. They assume that on that box that the piston says are weighed to the individual grams. So if they were ever off, that's the only way I could see it being off, is because they're not opening every box and weighing each piston. The rods, they for sure are, because each box that you get from Scat, those are for sure are within that gram weight, because I saw them do it, and they're thousands. So that's different. Same with the bearings and stuff. They're not weighing each individual one. They've already got them. They've already weighed them before, and they just use that same one on. That's the only way I can see it being off. They do put on the balancers or flywheels if you have to, and that's what was neat too. He said we would rather put the the weight on the harmonic balancer than we would on the actual crankshaft. So they'll actually drill, like if you ordered a external balance one that requires a weight on the dampener, the one that bolts on, they would rather drill out that to make the weight better for balancing than they would the actual crankshaft, which that's kind of neat because you could just pull it off and put it on someone else's. That made me a little, I don't know, because I don't know much about it, but I don't ever get anything externally balanced anyway, but it's a bit different. But anyway, that pretty much finishes up the crankshaft part. Now let's talk about the rods. Now the rods are a totally different deal. And I've got, this is different. So if you remember when I talked about the crankshaft, all that stuff was done, well, not all of it. Some of it was done overseas as far as the machine work and everything else. Not all of it. Now on the rods though, that's totally different. What they do is they have rods that are forged overseas. They're all Chinese and whatnot. And what they're done is, all they've done is bored them, and they've got a pin in here. So they did put the pin in, but it's not size. So they got a bronze bushing, of course, and they've threaded the holes. So when they actually take them out of the box from China, the holes are threaded. This is pressed in, everything's done, but it's not honed. They're not honed to size. There's no cap screw in it either, period. Now, this is where it gets interesting. They only use ARP bolts. I think before he said, well, you tried using A1s, and I don't know, I couldn't remember exactly why they stopped, but they only use ARP cap screws and rod bolts. As a matter of fact, he said they are the #1 seller of cap screws for ARP. That Scat is. So so you can think of this whole rod being Chinese, but that's American. These cap screws are American. And I'm gonna tell you what they do with them. So the first thing they'll do is they'll pop them out of the box. They examine them, and I saw them doing this. They'll examine them, put the cap back on, and they'll push it on, and then they've got a guy that will actually use a thread chaser to make sure the threads are good. Now, it's not a tap necessarily, it's just a chaser, make sure they're fine. At that point, they then take the new ARP cap screws, put the lube on, and put them in the block, and then they tighten them in sequences. So he's got different torque wrenches. And it goes, let's say this is 70, because these are ARP 2000s, so go 25, 50, 70. And then it puts in a different bin, and there's bunches of them. I didn't take pictures. Then you've got, I think there was 8 Sun-In hones, and you've got guys all day long in those hones that are honing them, and they're diamond hones, not diamond stones, not the ones most people use, but just a regular stone, but they're diamonds. They make the finish look different, you could tell. And they're honing them on both ends. And then they're checking them. I'm seeing them visually doing this on every single one. And then they put them over to the side. Once that's done, then it goes over to a separate thing. And I'm talking, you've got carts, and there are like a bunch of these rods on the carts just there. And they've got another guy he's got a little fixture set up, of course, to weigh them, where it's got the big end and small end, and it weighs them. And he's literally putting them in piles by their weights. And it's taking up a whole big old table. And then he'll put them in the box. Once they got 8 of them, he got another guy that dips them in this rust preservative, puts them in a bag, boom, sealed up with the weights, and out they go. So the rods, I will say, they're probably more manufactured in the United States as far as the sizings are than the crankshafts for sure. And that led me to a whole different discussion. So for instance, these right here came out of my Engine Master 540. These are Scats. Now there's no markings, of course, that say Scat on them, but these are Scat and they're H-beams, and these have the ARP 2000 cap screws, and I use this in the 540 that I did for Engine Master for 2014 and 13. They only got taken out because I'd switched to a different brand thinking that was better, but Now the 540 is the 565, and I've got a different set of rods that are in there now. And I'll be honest with you, I think these are actually better, and I probably made a mistake and wasted money doing it. But anyway, these are what came out. And I'm going to grab the camera and show you, because I get to talk about what Tom said about the rods, because that part to me was kind of interesting. So let me grab my camera and I can discuss this stuff with you. Okay, so here's the rod, and I want to show you this too. This is exactly how it came out of the engine. These are all, I grabbed 3. By the way, in case you're wondering what these bearings are, these are the Clevite coated ones. That's the only spot where the coating came off. And it had 1 season on these, and several engine pulls for the Engine Master Challenge for 2 years. Pretty good stuff. ARP 2000 cap screws, as you could tell. Things look pretty good. I mean, yeah. The only spot you saw was at the parting line. But anyway, in case you're wondering too, whenever I build an engines, I used to put which I still do whenever I do build engines, which is rare, I put how much clearance it had. These only had 2,000 clearance, which somebody's like, oh my gosh, that's tight. Yeah, I know. See any problems? Besides there. Yeah. So anyway, here's what he said about the rods, because I had a bunch of questions, and I hope I don't botch this. I asked him if you put, like, say, an L19 or a different cap screw in here, does it make the rod stronger? And I'm going to do my best to tell him the same way he told me. He said, when you look at this rod here, this tensile strength of this actual rod itself, so right here, is only about 180,000 PSI in tensile strength. So if you take your regular 8740, I think they're like 190,000 PSI tensile strength. So they're almost matching the same tensile strength as this rod itself. Point being is, you're not going to pull this out. The cap screw itself would break. So then you said you step up to this ARP 2000 and you've got 220,000 PSI of tensile strength, but you've only got 87,000 still on the rod. So he goes, think of it like that. So that was just him talking about the actual tensile strength of that, which then led to another thing. So I was like, well, doesn't it take more force though to pull this off? And what about the stretch? Now this was different. If you notice from Scat, they will tell you what to torque these down to, because that's what they torque them to whenever they're sizing them. So it also gives you the correct sizing. He goes, I actually do not recommend using stretch to stretch your bolts. And so, of course, I had questions of why, and it made perfect sense. If you look at stretch, there's a maximum value. So if you think of like a piece of metal, once you start tightening, it takes a lot of force at first to get it to move. Then it takes less force once it's moving. And to a point, then it snaps and breaks. That's kind of how stretch works. If you were to take this cap screw here and you tighten it down to its maximum stretch, it takes less energy to keep it moving now, because it's already stretched, before it will break. If you bring it to, if you torque it down before it's at its maximum stretch, when it starts pulling, it's going to take more energy to get it to its maximum stretch. And so you're on the other side of the curve, the good side. So if you can think of like a curve, he said, curve here. This being the maximum stretch. Picture this being the maximum stretch. This is like before. So if you under a lot of stress, you're starting to stretch it and you get to its maximum strength. If you tightened it with stretch and you got it to its maximum stretch point, you're now on the downward hill before it snaps. And he goes, you can actually measure this if you have a rod that fails. What you could do is you could take your cap screw and you can measure before and after, and you'll see that it's gotten thinner right before it snapped, and that's a clear sign that you had overstretched it and it failed that way. And he goes, you would think that metal will return to normal, but it doesn't. Another thing that can happen is just because you keep reusing the same cap screw, the metal stretch each time you tighten them down, and eventually they fail because they don't return back to normal 100%. So it causes it to fail there. And I was like, wow, it did make sense. As far as the cap screw material, that was the one he had about that. Me personally, I still use ARP 2000s and just about everything. So I think, and I have seen them fail, but not for the reasons of the cap screw itself, but I have seen them break, I should say. But it's not because of the cap screw or anything else. Here's what I mean. And rods, I think, are like they're like the valves for the cylinder heads. Valves get blamed for everything, when in reality, you've crashed a valve into the piston, and then it bent it, and then it finally broke, but it's the valve's fault. I think rods are about the same situation, because I've seen several where it doesn't have enough oil flow, and it spins this rod bearing, so this whole thing gets blue and heated up. And as metal heats up, it becomes weaker. And eventually, it breaks that. I have seen that happen and break a 2000, but it wasn't because of the cap screw, it was because it was already spinning a bearing. But anyway, I wanted to talk about that. But here's something else he had said that was kind of cool. Because I talked to him and I said, well, there's this other company, you know, that they sell Chinese rods too, just like yours, but they say they're billet steel. And he goes, that's hogwash, you know, that's bullshit. And I think that was the words. He goes, truth be known, every forged rod comes from billet. I mean, that's how they come. You take a billet rod, the billet rod's the way they come. It's a billet 4340 material, and they smash it down, and that's forged to make this. And it looks like a dumbbell, he said, when they first start making them. So you got a fat end here and a little end here. And what happens is, if you look at that grain structure, because you forced it that way, the grain's actually going all the way around like this when you forged it in that material. Instead of, if it was just a regular forge, which would be a blank rod, you'd have nothing but straight lines, right? Well, that one's only that big. That little grain here is only that big. If you smash it down, now the grain's that big. It goes all the way around. It goes, so it's stronger that way, instead of having like little ones here and here and here. I was like, okay. And he goes, I could tell you that guys, the other company, they're not forged and they're not billet rods. That's just marketing gimmick. Because I could say these are billet rods because they were made from a billet 4340, but they're still forged. And it made sense because if you looked at it in between. And the company I'm talking about, I won't make it, but it's in the engine now. But if you look at the rod itself, scats are actually wider here, which then brought up something else. He said, I've caught a lot of flack for what I do to lighten the rod. I will have a hole right through here, which if you've ever seen some of the lightweight scat rods, they do have a hole right through there. And he goes, the reason why, that is doing nothing. That spot right there has nothing to do with the strength of the rod. So having that hole there means nothing. Its strength is here and here. That's where and that's true. If you ever seen a rod break, it's usually here and here. It's not in the center right there. And he goes, so I've caught a lot of flack, but it takes the weight out of it. And I was like, makes sense. And they do have a power adder rod that's thicker than this beam, and it's better, but they do have the hole there to reduce the weight. So it's still strong in the areas that it should be in, and it takes some of the weight out, so it's not. Because also you got to think of the crankshaft. The heavier that rod is, force equals mass times acceleration. You're going to have more stress on that crankshaft. So I thought that was very interesting as well. And then he bring up something else. He said, and this is said it in a different spot. He goes, you know, there are a lot of companies that claim to be made in America, and they're not. And their rods are the same situation. They can claim their rods are made in America or their crankshafts made in America, and goes, they're not. I've been sued by a company because that said that I claimed my stuff was made in America. And he goes, it's state by state. And I said this in the AFR video. Made in America isn't the same if it was someone put it in a box that was made in Oklahoma versus California versus Texas versus Ohio. It won't, they're all different. In order for this product, since it's made in California, to be claimed made in America, 100% of this had to be made in America. There are other states when they could say claimed made in America, when all they have to use is just that cap screw that's made in America. The rest of it can be considered that. So they could be based on the value. Well, the most valuable thing being the cap screw, not that. So that's kind of gets tricky when it says made in America, but truly it's Chinese rod just with American cap screws. There's no universal state to state. So he's like, some of the crankshafts that people are selling right now, they're claiming made in America, are not made in America. And you could tell it was ruffling his feathers because he's like, I promise you my stuff's as good, and it's just as American as theirs. And I can't argue with it. I haven't been to their manufacturing facility, but I did find the whole conversation interesting. So in my opinion, now this is where I'm going to stray off from theirs. I enjoy Scat products, partly because when I first started Engine Masters, they did help me out. But in all fairness, I really haven't had any failures. If you look at the S10 has a Scat I-beam rods, the Pro Comp ones with the cap screws, and it's got a Scat, just a regular 4340 crank, not even lightweight, and it's done fine. Now, I do use ARP 2000 cap screws. The Camaro actually has a Scat 4340 crankshaft now. It doesn't have, it has a different set of rods now, but it used to have these in it. And that crankshaft's been in there forever. It doesn't even have the center counterweights. I haven't had any really bad issues with the Scat stuff. I did ask Tom too, because this is another question somebody asked. what do you prefer, the I-beam or H-beam? And then, of course, he gave the question back to me. I said, well, I actually prefer the I-beam because they weigh less. But it might be saying, why do you have an H-beam? Because a lot of their kits, when you get them balanced, you can only have them at the H-beam. Now, of course, you can do different. You can say, I want an I-beam in the kit, not the H-beam. But he goes, it's like if you like pepperoni pizza or Canadian bacon. I mean, everybody's got their own opinion on that deal. We make them strong, so there's not much of a difference. And I kind of am in the same opinion. I prefer the I-beams are actually in the S10's engine because they do weigh less by about 20 grams than these H-beams. So I think they're just as strong. Now, boost deals, they've got, of course, thicker rods, so they're using on their H-beam stuff, they're thicker. Although there's some pretty strong I-beams. Scat just doesn't have an I-beam design that's can compete with their H-beam as far as strength goes in that area, as far as the power outer stuff. So anyway, I've probably given you a whole bunch of information. And if you have questions, because I'm going to try to call Tom this week anyway and ask some different questions as well. But if you have questions you would like me to try asking him, put them in the comments and I'll see if I can't get some answers. And if I give him some incorrect information, please don't bash me too hard. So I'm far more versed on cylinder heads than I am on crankshafts and rods, but I did enjoy the visit. And I'm going to tag some pictures on here so you can kind of see. Thanks for watching. I hope I did it justice. Scat makes good products and I'm happy to use them. So I'm trying to get them convinced to see if they can't do an endurance test to prove how strong they are. We'll see how that works. But you guys take care. I did want to add one more thing about the whole China products as well. Usually when we think of China, we think of something that's like an inferior product. It really depends on where in China or who in China is making the product. And what I mean by this is, like Scat, for instance, if they go to a good place to have their crankshafts ground, they're going to get a good crankshaft. However, there's plenty of places in China that will do it cheaper and not as good job. So it really depends on how much the American company is paying the China company to make. Because China can make good products, and yes, it pains me to say that, but it really depends on how much you're paying. I want to point that out because of I know a lot of their stuff's imported. And don't think I'm like, use China. I just want to state that not all China products are horrible. And I just want to get that out there. Not that I'm promoting them, but I do want to be honest. So just thought I'd tell you. You guys, again, thanks for watching. By the way, if you're a manufacturer and you would like for me to do a tour of your facility and try to film it to put on there and give people information, I'd be happy to do it. I've got a few that I'm going to try doing in the next few months or something. And go from there, and hopefully you can see more of it. Thanks for watching. This is a longer video, and you've had some great patience.